Welcome to all of you who are joining us. Hello to everybody. I'm Rob James. I'm the pastor here. It will be 7 years next month that I've been here. It's been a really blessed month. We're really excited to have all of you here. Welcome. This fasting group is a few things you don't even expect. God will move in ways that beyond your imagination, closer to God in ways that you didn't prepare. That's mine. So let's pray together. God, we thank you. Thank you for your trust in us. We thank you for opportunities to be closer to you, for the opportunity to pray. We ask you to bless all of those who participated in this group, those who are attending, those who participated in learning. Help them to see you in ways that remains wonderful. Help us become a part of something ancient, a part of something that can change our lives. We ask all these things in the name of your Son, in the name of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Pastor.
As you first asked me on that first session, which I think kind of a background to understanding all of this, was the question of covenant. And what does covenant mean? And that's predominantly what I spoke about in that introductory session. And so let me share here what I said in that context, serving as a background to all of this and what will be the issue of how does the question of fasting fall into this notion of covenant and covenantal relationship.
Yes, covenant, yes.
So, and I do really appreciate being invited to be a part of this. And as you said, as a rabbi, I come from a Judaic perspective, and sometimes, particularly in English, we may use the same word, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we mean by it precisely the same thing. And frankly, that's true even within sort of, broadly speaking, what we might call a particular faith community. Faith communities can be broad. So certainly, it may not be the case that someone coming from the Greek Orthodox tradition means precisely the same thing that someone means when they're coming from a Baptist tradition, even though they both fall within, broadly speaking, the Christian faith community. And of course, all the more so when we may be of different faiths, but nevertheless, they're similar, but also different. And I know that there were times, as I said, when I was speaking with my cousins, and we share grandparents, parents who grew up together, and we would see each other, but that didn't necessarily mean that when we were speaking, we meant exactly the same thing, because there were differences based on how we were raised, how terminology was used in each of our environments. But perhaps the most significant thing which I want to lay out and propose when it comes to the idea of the Judaic view of covenant, which I think is, in terms of what I'm going to say, I'm going to present this as diametrically opposed views. And I'm probably going to make it sound more extreme than it actually really is, in order to make a point clearer. Because in truth, I think that what I'm about to talk about is really in terms of sort of a spectrum, but I'm going to present it as the extremes of the spectrum, even though as I go on, I think there's a lot more overlap. In general, though, I think that Judaism tends towards one end of the spectrum, and that Christian faith is more towards the other end of the spectrum regarding what I'm about to suggest. So in Christian faith, there's a covenant with God, right? You have a covenant with God. That's great. And who made the covenant, right? God's the one who initiates the covenant. And hopefully we're open to accepting and receiving the covenant, that covenantal relationship. But in Jewish terms, we tend to look at certain biblical covenantal events in thinking about how covenant relates to us. So there's the covenant that God makes with Noah, and therefore also with all of humanity as the descendants of Noah, right? When upon departing the ark and seeing the rainbow in the sky. God's covenant is a promise, a contract, because a covenant fundamentally is a contract. It may be a sacred contract, not a profane contract. And by profane, I don't mean it in a negative sense, but in the sense of ordinary and commonplace.
Mhm.
So a covenant, especially in terms of how we tend to use the word, we usually mean it in a sacred context, but it's still a sacred contract, a sacred promise. This covenant is made with Noah individually and with others who have come off the ark with him, but everyone else after presumably gets the benefit, right? And that includes us. And frankly, that's not unusual. We all live with the reality that sometimes other people in the past have instituted things which become part of us and our expectations, whether we like it or not. Right? You're born as an American, right? You have all the benefits and expectations of American law, and you didn't choose that. You could leave, go somewhere else, but if you're considered an American citizen, it will nevertheless be expected regarding you, at least in theory. Anyone who has tried to say to official authorities, whether in law enforcement or in the courtroom, I do not accept your authority. Well, that's fine, as they take you off to the hoosegow. Certainly, that's true of the covenant that God will then make with Abraham and his line, especially through Isaac and Jacob. And therefore, we understand that that covenant that God makes with Abraham includes all the descendants, or at least through that line, Abraham and his descendants. But the covenant itself is made specifically between God and Abraham. And there's an understanding, particularly here, although also with Noah, though that's seen as a universal covenant, right? There's an understanding with Abraham here that it's a contract, that there are certain obligations. There's a kind of partnership. And in fact, that comes out to an extent, right, when God feels obliged to tell Abraham about his decision to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And not only, right, as we see in the biblical text, not only because Abraham's nephew, Lot, and his family are there, but because God is, well, I have this relationship. And remember this visitation of the three angels who will initially first inform Abraham and Sarah about, in their old age, the child that they are to have, but following that, informing him of the decision to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. But remember that visitation occurs right after Abraham has circumcised himself and his household as a sign of that covenant. So we see the implications of that covenantal relationship, this partnership in a sense. Yes, God may be the senior partner, but we do have certain expectations as junior partners in that partnership. At times, God may seem to be playing the role of the silent partner, which is to say, listen, you know what you're supposed to do. I don't have to necessarily opt in every other moment. And there seems to be, therefore, a presumption of trust,
Mhm.
which is part of that. And hopefully we live up to that expectation of trust, mostly. But I do think back to when I was a teenager, I'd be going out, and my parents would say to me the worst possible thing. They wouldn't say, don't do this, or don't do that, or don't get into trouble. But my mother would look at me and she'd say, your father and I trust you.
Mm.
And I would think, no, don't trust me, right? Because that would have been an excuse for anything I did. If they did not trust me, I would have been able to say, at least to myself, and I could try it with them, that, come on, you knew you couldn't really trust me, right? So you can't really blame me. You knew who I was.
Mm.
But it was terrible what my parents said to me, right? Because I did not want to break their trust. And I can't say that I was perfect, but, and I think this is like with God, I do think that there's an element of trust, or at least the
Mm.
opportunity to prove the trust. We all know what happens when trust is broken, and there are consequences which come with that. And it is difficult to repair trust in the best of circumstances, right? The other party, and in the divine context, God, hopefully wants us to prove ourselves again, wants to give us the opportunity, but there's going to need to be some, not just time, but time in which we demonstrate that the mistakes that we previously made, the violence to the relationship which
Mm.
we caused, that we have genuinely turned over a new leaf.
Wow.
I can now be trusted again. It
That's
is
a
true.
strong term, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Violence to the relationship. My goodness.
But I think that that's true, right? When
Yeah.
you break trust with someone, that is a kind of violence to relationship, right?
Yeah.
And we have to say, right, it's true, in the past I broke that trust, but it can be repaired.
Mhm.
And that means that the bond is never really gone.
Mhm.
It may have gone into a low point. The relationship may have become tenuous,
Mhm.
but when the opportunity to re-earn trust is there, I think that's a notion that the bond, or in the divine context, that the covenant is not broken.
Mhm.
It's damaged, but not broken. But for Jews, there's something even more significant than the covenant with Noah and the covenant with Abraham, and that's the covenant at Mount Sinai. And here is where I think the Jewish understanding of covenant tends to have somewhat of a different view, generally speaking, than most of the time the Christian understanding of covenant, which is that, unlike the earlier covenants, the covenant at Mount Sinai is not made directly, I guess I would say, from the Jewish point of view, it's not made in the first instance with each human being. The covenant is made with the people of Israel, not the individuals who are part of the people, but with the people of Israel as a group. It's made with what we might refer to as the corporate entity. Now, of course, the group is made up of individuals, and so we are expected to live up to all of the requirements of that covenant because we are members of the group. But in a certain sense, it's the group as an entity which mediates that relationship, that understanding of the covenant. Now, that does not mean that we as Jews don't believe that we can have an individual and personal relationship with God. That's also possible as well. But in a certain sense, from a traditional Jewish point of view, that is somewhat secondary. And I'll use an example which will make the most sense for anyone who may have seen what now at this point I have to admit is a relatively old movie, but it's a movie, an animated film called Ants with a Z.
Yeah, that's an old movie.
Right, which starred the voice of Woody Allen. And it's about a colony of ants. You've got the community, and they're all just going along and doing their thing with kind of no individuality. And the Woody Allen ant is the individual who stands out. And there is in that an important message that's part of that. But what comes around in the end is that ultimately they're all striving for the benefit of the colony. And he finds his true identity not in giving up his individualism, but in channeling it for the greater good of the colony. And in a certain sense, if you look at the colony as being the primary focus and framework, that tends to be the Jewish perspective, the perspective of Jewish peoplehood. Whereas I think frequently from a Christian perspective, you prioritize a personal relationship with God. Among other things, you say, what do we want to do with that personal relationship, right? Well, we want to join together. And in fact, the church urges us to join together with others who share a similar individual relationship with the Spirit. Now, we all recognize within a Christian community that for everyone, there's a place for commonality. But if you start with an individual covenantal relationship with God, and then think of forming together with others to create a church in order to better accomplish those things that one can't really do alone as individuals only by themselves. Now, in a lot of cases, I'm not sure that the implications of the end product are necessarily always that different, depending on whether or not you start with the group, which then leads to the individual, or whether you start with the individual and that leads to the group. But I do think that there are times when there can be different implications as to what the meaning of it is, depending on which directions we start from and come from in that sense. And so I'm sharing from the rabbinic perspective that we typically are looking at the covenant as a people, which also therefore means certainly we're all taught primarily to have responsibility here for others because our responsibility is to the group and the group is made up of individuals, right? To not stand idly by the blood of our neighbor. To not ask the rhetorical question, for which, of course, the true answer is in the opposite. Am I my brother's keeper? Yes, yes, you are. Right? And that's not an excuse for acting badly. We all know that those are universal expectations, But I think sometimes there can be at least slight nuanced differences when you say, well, if God's covenant is with the people as a whole, my primary obligation is to God, certainly, and also to others, to the group with whom God has made a covenantal relationship. And in order to care for the group, I have to care for each of the other individuals of the group.
Mm.
If I start from the perspective of as an individual, that doesn't mean I don't have any obligations to help, but I would look at it as being told individually that I have an obligation to help, as opposed to the group being told that they have an obligation for one another. It is a slightly different organic character to it when
Yeah.
it comes from that perspective, as opposed to the other perspective.
Mhm.
And I'll add one more element, which I think helps understand the Judaic perspective of covenant. Generally, in traditional Jewish practice, although I should say it's not necessarily always true for the most liberal and progressive theological Jewish denominations these days. But from a more traditionalist kind of perspective, there is this idea of Judaism that we focus on the law and legalism and whatnot. And there is a truth to that, but I do want to share what that truth means from an internal Jewish perspective. Frequently, I know, and I know that I'm guilty of this, that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. And when we're not as steeped in understanding others as we are of ourselves, we have a tendency sometimes to mischaracterize others. Sometimes, and I hate to say this, this may occur because one has a pernicious motivation, right? Which is, I'm going to tell you what your faith and belief really means, and not listen to you tell me what it means, right? I mean, you can tell me and I'll say, yeah, you can say that, but I know better than you do, right? And there's certainly a significant degree of arrogance in that. But when one has pernicious motivations, that's not surprising. All of this reminds me, my best friend as a young kid growing up was Brad Anderson. I first met him in kindergarten. And I recall an argument I had with him in first grade. And I was familiar with the author Hans Christian Andersen,
Mhm.
right? And in our argument, I tried to tell him that the spelling of his last name was E-N, as in Hans Christian Andersen, and not O-N, as it really was. We went to his mother, and surprised, she confirmed that he knew how to spell his last name, right? But I think sometimes, even as adults, we have a tendency to do that, to try to suggest that somehow we understand the meaning of someone else's faith tradition better than they do, especially if it fits comfortably in the box we'd like them to fit
Mhm.
into. Truthfully, I think more often than not, when this occurs, it's not really done in a pernicious way, and it's well-meaning, but nevertheless, if we are open to admitting it, what's really being shown is our ignorance. And so, as I said, I'm certainly, unfortunately, subject to this at times, and I think too often the Christian community um, uh, can mischaracterize um, the Jewish self-understanding of the role of law and legalism, because it comes from a different place. And so what I'd like to do, because I think it's part of our understanding of covenant, I'd like to explain this a little bit more clearly.
Oh, yes, please.
So if we start with this notion of covenant and obligations to others as part of the group, and our obligations to God, our obligation to the community, right? That's right out of our Torah, right? The Jewish tradition, the 5 books of Moses, right? It's filled in part with all of these commandments. You must do this. You must not do that, right? Because this is what the Torah says. This is what I must necessarily do or not do, right? I need to take care of the community in practical, physical terms, and I need to take care of the community in spiritual terms and the relationship that community can have with God. Because the community can't really do anything by itself, right? It takes individuals to actually do the work of the community. The community is only made up of individuals. The community is not a independently active entity, except to the extent that its members take action with the community as their ultimate goal. But there's one other element which I'll add. So it's true that the fundamental Jewish concept of action is, in Hebrew, the mitzvah, the commandment. And a commandment is just a command. It's an order, right? When we say commandment, though, it takes on this spiritual meaning, right? If we talked about the 10 orders, that would feel military now. And it's true, different faith traditions sometimes use military language, but a commandment, right, that feels different. In English, that brings it now to a spiritual sensibility. Notwithstanding that being true, from the Jewish point of view, the commandments are concerned, as is the Torah as a whole, with literally every aspect of life, the profane and the sacred, our relationship with God, right? Our expectations towards God, but also expectations towards other human beings, right? And that means towards the world which God gave us to care for in partnership with God, who is, of course, not only the creator, but continually the true owner of the world in which we have been entrusted with its care. We can take appropriate advantage of the world, but not too big of an advantage, which unfortunately too often we do. But the other and final aspect I want to mention is that in the Jewish tradition, the idea of the letter of the law really is not in opposition in our terms with the spirit of the law. Because we see the purpose of the letter of the law is to make concrete the spirit. Because values from our point of view may be wonderful. They can sound great and lofty. But the problem is that what they can too often just be is lofty, floating around in the air. My question as a Jew is, okay, but how do I take ultimate values and put them in continual daily practice? Do I just say, I just kind of rely on the spirit of the law. right? If someone tells me, and I'm not talking about in a religious context, someone just tells me generally like, I observe the spirit of not stealing. I want to know what they thieve because they've put it out there, right? Even if it's just, some pens and paper clips from the office, right? If they're not permitted to take them, it's just wrong. There are economists who have quantified that how many hundreds of millions of dollars on a national scale that companies lose through each of those little things adding up. Now, I'm not saying that grand theft auto isn't worse than taking home some pens and paper. For sure it is. But if it doesn't belong to me, it's theft, right?
Yes.
Or is it that simple? So the question is, from a Jewish point of view, how do I know specifically, right? And is there anything which is so insignificant that it's sort of considered accepted in our society? This is a question. I'm not answering it at the moment, right? I'm just sort of sharing how the Jewish point of view works, right? So one of the Jewish concerns would be wrestling with business questions and business law, and not really just for me as an individual, but again, for the well-being of the community as a whole, to be able to understand and make a determination, right? Maybe there are certain things that you can take, right? Maybe it's true that it is accepted in some context that, yeah, it's fine. They know that in most offices, and they don't have a problem with it. They know you're going to take home some paper clips, so long as it's not you starting to take home a whole case of paper or something, right? Because now it's a problem, right? But if it's only one sheet, um, it, it's not a problem from their point of view, right? But determination from a formal legal perspective, say, we've wrestled with this and we've thought about it, and theft is an important value not to engage in, but maybe there are certain common expectations, right? So there may be limitations on the edge about that, but the idea is of wrestling with it in the law as a community, and not leaving it just up to me as an individual to decide that I'm close enough, right? I don't just get to decide if I'm within what I believe is the bounds of the spirit of what it is, right? The Jewish tradition is constantly looking at the letter of the law, but not for its own sake, but so that it's a reflection of and a practical instantiation of the spirit of the law. And hopefully at its best, that's the true of any system of justice. When the book of Judges says that everyone did what was right in their own eyes, right? That's not a good thing, right? From the Jewish point of view, that's like, yeah, everyone gets to decide if what they're doing is in the spirit of the values, right? So the Jewish perspective of law is, yeah, we can't simply leave it up to each individual's eyes. And as I said, I think that that's true of any system of justice, not merely one which sees itself as being faith-based. Now, I'm not saying that all those systems of justice are perfect, right? And I'm not saying that there aren't any that may be evil. And I'm not saying, frankly, I'm not even saying that with any human-based law, that sometimes laws can't be established based on evil values and not always good values. I think, unfortunately, we've seen that is true, but nevertheless, law at its best
Mhm.
is an attempt to put before us some guidance as how to implement in day-to-day living our highest values. And hopefully, our highest values are also good values. But truly, the final word for me as part of this is that it doesn't mean, from a Jewish point of view, that the law is necessarily where it should end. There is in Jewish tradition the Hebrew term lifnim mishurat adin, which isn't usually translated literally because it doesn't quite work. But what it really means is beyond the letter of the law. The letter of the law is not necessarily the end point. For us, it may just be the foundation, right? But we can choose to go above and beyond the law. And in fact, we should strive for that. There was a 13th century Spanish Jewish sage who's known most commonly as Nachmanides, who brought up the idea that one could be, as he says in Hebrew, a naval bireshut haTorah, that one could be a wicked person within the confines, within the borders of the Torah, because even in a sacred legal tradition, unfortunately, there will be people who want to push the envelope, who will be able to find loopholes in order to try to get around what it can be, to try to get around the spirit, but allowing them to say, but I didn't cross the borderline. I haven't broken the law. And that's because they don't care about it sincerely. They're the ones who manipulate current law for their own advantage and are only concerned with its use for perverse means of their own, while hopefully, from their point of view, not endangering themselves from authority. People who are truly committed to what the values of the law are will say, the law, this is a great place for me to start. But ultimately, what I need to be concerned about is being able ethically and spiritually to start from a mature foundation with the law in order to reach further, either for the benefit of ourselves or for the rest of the world, and of course, for the benefit of our partnership with God. And I think that from a Jewish point of view, that's kind of how we see the meaning of covenant and also its relationship with the idea of law as being an element of that covenantal relationship.
Thank you so much, Rabbi, for those foundational comments. Let me ask you a question, because looking at the people part, the collective identity, as you had mentioned, the term you used at first, how is covenant, God being the originator and the owner, we're stewards of the earth and all that he has created. How, I'm trying to see how the word democracy or the form of government democracy fits with covenant, since it is very much collective people, I wouldn't say driven or governed, perhaps.
Well, I think that this is part of, at least from the Jewish point of view, it's part of the partnership relationship. That democracy still exists and is based within that covenantal relationship. It has certain guidelines and framework, right? But we as partners with God as a community, right? How does the community work that out, right? The community works that out within the confines of the framework, right? And the community can, I'm not saying it has to, right? I mean, democracy predominantly is a pretty modern phenomenon. I mean, yes, we have elements of, ancient Greece, although even there, right, democracy was only reserved for a small few. Not everyone was a citizen who was entitled to be part of democratic institutions. And even as we saw in antiquity, right, democracy could sometimes also interweave with autocrats at times. Certainly, we know we can see that in a more modern context. And if we think of the Constitution of the United States as kind of being a secular covenantal structure for us, right? I mean, we know that not everyone was considered to fall within the democratic rights as initially understood when the Constitution was established. Let me put this maybe even in a little broader context, as a way of, I think, also seeing some of this, and from a Jewish point of view, I think some of the implications of differences between our American way of thinking about democracy and sort of a traditional Jewish understanding of our relationship. And let me start by putting the covenant and law in the following context, right? As I said, from a Jewish point of view, the covenant includes the law as a major element of it. But it's not only the law. And I'll present this in a couple of ways. Let's take this foundational covenant at Mount Sinai, right? What's the symbol of the covenant? Right? It's the tablets of the law. That's the symbol. The tablets are the symbol of the covenant. They can't be separated from it. And in fact, when one makes a covenant in Hebrew, you say that one cuts or carves a covenant, just as the tablets were carved. And as an element of this, and as you mentioned when we first met, it came just on the heels of Jews having celebrated that past Thursday night through the Sabbath on Saturday night for 2 days, the festival of Shavuot, literally the festival of weeks, often also referred to as the Jewish Pentecost. But one of the main elements of the festival of Shavuot is that it is a celebration of God's giving of the Torah to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. One of the images in the Jewish tradition is that the covenant at Sinai is like a marriage, right? The holy covenant of marriage, right? We're all familiar with that terminology. And in the imagery of the Jewish tradition, God is the groom and the Jewish people as a whole are the bride. And what are the tablets of the covenant? They're the marriage contract, known in Hebrew as the ketubah. And in a traditional Jewish marriage contract, although it comes from an ancient, one could say patriarchal perspective, so usually the specified obligations are unidirectional of the groom towards the bride. Hopefully, certainly their relationship flows in both directions. But in terms of the traditional language from antiquity, there are in the contract specific obligations, as I said, that the groom has towards the bride. It's also expected, but not written out in the contract, because certainly in a pre-modern times, unfortunately, even too often in contemporary times, but certainly in earlier times, that uh, in terms of the common social structure, right, men and husbands had much more control and power dynamic vis-a-vis their wives.
Mhm.
And so the written contract wanted to formalize the clear obligations that the husband would have towards his wife for her benefit.
Mhm.
But beyond that, while not written in the marriage contract, there were certain expectations of the bride
Yeah.
to the groom.
Mhm.
And so if you think about it from a Jewish point of
Mhm.
view, that's kind of the difference between law and covenant. Covenantal law is one of the fundamental ways in which the covenant is understood, but it's not limited to that. And the covenant is, if we see it kind of as a marital relationship,
Mhm.
which, if we think about it, in the best relationship with a partner, especially a marital partner, right, you may want to give a gift. And sometimes, right, they may love it, right? You thought it up yourself, right? It was original. They weren't expecting it. That's fantastic. But also, and I would suggest more fundamental to make your partner happy, is to understand what are their expectations, right? Concrete expectations, right? That show, I love
Or
you.
needs, as I remember you did say the first time, it's the need.
Right. And it doesn't just come from what I want to share with you, as nice as that is, right? Here, I gave you a gift, right? I love you. Well, as a partner, it's, oh, I believe that, okay, right? But really, can you take out the garbage?
Yeah.
Right? The house stinks, and I've got arthritis, and I can't do it. And if you really want to show your love for me, then you'll take out the garbage. And that's more important than the bouquet of flowers.
Mhm.
As nice as it is that you bring them home, because, eventually they're going to rot and go in the garbage.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
there is that kind of element. But I think
Okay.
along with sort of seeing that, from the Jewish point of view, as kind of the, what should a marital relationship be about? Well, it should be, yes, showing love in spontaneous ways, but also understanding, right, what obligations do
Mhm.
I have as part of that. I tend to think that from an American point of view, and we don't usually use the word covenant, but I think our Constitution, as I said, um, flows from that way of thinking, that I'd like to share what I think is this kind of um, typical American way of thinking about, and I think democracy somewhat comes into
Okay. Yeah.
here
Well,
in a
let
different
me
way.
Rabbi, let me inject a couple of maybe more
Sure.
churchy kinds of terms. Would be autonomy is a big concept, like in the host church for this seminar is a Baptist church, which tends to be autonomous, but yet a collective group. So democratic, yeah, that might seem similar, but certainly autonomy is a more churchy one.
Yes, and I should say, um, perhaps the most liberal of the Jewish denominations, um, speaks a lot about autonomy. But I think in part what makes I think there are a lot of reasons, which I won't, it's beyond the scope of what we're talking about. There are a lot of reasons for why their theology developed in the way that it did, which I don't think is because they're attempting to be, Christian. But I think from the long standing traditional Jewish perspective, I mean, we recognize that we're autonomous, but when you see the peoplehood, right, as being the primary lens through which you see things, you kind of say, like, I'm not really autonomous, right?
Mm.
It doesn't originate in me. And this is where I think our American way of thinking reflects, to an extent, I don't know if it consciously reflected it, but I think reflects a Christian way of thinking about things. Certainly, there were other, at least presumably non-religious ideas which influenced the founders when they wrote both the Constitution with its Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence, you know, the writings of John Locke and so forth. But fundamental, right, to our thinking, both in that Declaration of Independence, even though it doesn't have formal legal status, but certainly as enumerated and expanded in the Constitution, as I said, with the Bill of Rights and with later amendments, right? The fundamental idea is about rights, our presumably inalienable rights, which I should add, we don't necessarily accord those to legal aliens. That's a whole separate issue in American law, right? But the fundamental idea is this idea of rights, which means I have entitlements, right, to my own autonomy. And I can do, right, I'm entitled to do through my autonomy whatever I want, as long as I don't infringe upon your rights, your entitlements, and your autonomy, which therefore means, by the way, right, that I can just focus on achieving my own benefits, right? And at its best, I'm also interested in helping you achieve your benefits if I'm a magnanimous person, right? But there's always the danger of selfishness, which is part of that. Because if we start with it's about me instead of it's about we, about us, right? That's where the potential for selfishness occurs. Now, to be fair, right, the Constitution starts with the words, we, the people of the United States of America. So, right, it's interesting. Right? They're kind of both woven together. There is an idea of banding together to achieve certain things, but there's also this idea of my autonomy. I'll also add that, I've talked about here sort of the potential dangers of starting with the self and selfishness, right? But there's also a struggle when one starts from a place where you see yourself as first and foremost having obligations to the group and the community, even before yourself, right? Because at times the weight is heavier when it's not just for yourself. Because I mean, right, sort of an excuse. Well, if I don't have obligations to the other, right, I don't have to do it. It's okay, right? Maybe a bunch of other people will probably do it. Right? So you can try to get out of things if you're coming from a place which emphasizes my rights and my autonomy, right? And, aside from that, right, you can say, I can live with only being responsible for myself, right? I can live with making questionable choices just because I want to, maybe because it's going to be fun, or I'm lazy, or whatever. But when we have expectations to others, right, burden also comes with the expectation, and that's hard, right?
Yeah.
And some people will rebel against that, right? Because they don't want that, right? I can take the consequences for myself and my actions, good or bad. I don't want to be responsible for the consequences of the group. Because if we're all in it together, then what I do extends to everyone else.
Mm.
And that may be too much pressure for me. So I think, when we think in terms of autonomy and whatnot, as an American, and I was born in this country, I was raised as American. I was also raised in the home of a rabbi. And so I was influenced certainly both by the traditional Jewish Judaic point of view, but certainly I grew up enmeshed in an American way of thinking. And even without realizing it, some of what I'm sharing are things which became more clearly apparent to me as I got older and put them in their sort of own context, right? But sort of recognizing, and this is where I sort of come back to in that original statement I made about the sort of Christian tendency of that understanding of covenant versus a traditional Jewish understanding of covenant, which, as I said, I think does come out in the typical American way of thinking about things,
Yeah.
which is, where do we start from? Do I start with my personal autonomy, which I then may choose to limit some of my autonomy for the benefit of others, for the benefit of the
Okay.
group, for the
Yeah. So
benefit of the
that, yeah.
church, right?
Yeah.
But it starts with my understanding of, yes, I have this personal covenantal relationship
Mhm.
with God. I start from an autonomous place of that personal covenantal relationship, as opposed to the traditional Jewish
Yeah.
view, which is, yes, I obviously have concerns with individuals. And do I have autonomy? In a limited way. I have
Mhm.
autonomy in those areas where communal law, because of the notion of the communal covenant,
Mhm.
right? In those areas where my obligations to the community and my obligations to God are not overriding, there's room for
Yeah.
me to exercise individualism. But that individualism and that autonomy, traditionally speaking, is for sure
Yeah.
strained because of this idea of the primacy of the group.
Yeah. So okay, and that's very clear at this point, Rabbi. And hopefully this doesn't cut off, but a side question that was in the room was where is grace in the Hebrew mindset, in the covenant of God? Where is grace?
So grace, we don't usually use that
What
language,
word?
but it doesn't mean that we don't have it, right?
So what word do you use?
Um, when we talk about divine mercy, right? The merciful God, right?
Mhm.
That's grace in the sense that, and the Jewish tradition talks about this, right? Because we are all imperfect human beings, right? Even if, as from a Jewish point of view, we don't have the notion of original sin, right?
Mhm.
But we're all imperfect, right? We're all sinful because of our, you know, because we fall short at times. And the Jewish perspective says, there's the covenant, and with that comes law and expectations. And that's what we're striving for. And as I said, hopefully to even strive beyond that by understanding the values that underlie the law. But ultimately, we're going to fall short. And the Jewish tradition says, unfortunately, too often when we do fall short, if God really gave us the consequences that were equitable for the severity of our offense against God and other human beings, right? That we would end up on the losing end.
Yeah.
And so the notion for Jews of divine mercy, what you might call, at least from our way of thinking of grace, is to say that God says, if I were really going to be strictly just based on law, I would give you a much more severe consequence. But I love you. And I know and hopefully I know that you're trying. And we have a covenantal relationship. And when you have a relationship with someone, right, and as parents, we often know this, right? Which is sometimes we will give our child not an inappropriate consequence, but a consequence which is mediated through our love and compassion with our child. And in that sense, it's like, you know what, I should ground you for a year because of what you did.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. But I'm not going to,
Yeah.
right? I'm going to be merciful, right? Because I love you and because we're a family and we have a relationship, right? And so I'm going to ground you for a week plus whatever else comes along with it. I think that's the Jewish kind of perspective. That's how we would look as sort of our equivalent of grace.
Yes, yes, yeah. Sandra, Dr. Blair, anything for Rabbi before he closes?
I like the fact that you said the law it should be not the end point, but the starting point of where we are ethically, morally, and spiritually. It should be a starting point. Without an absolute value on things, we are totally lost as humans. There's got to be an absolute somewhere that we can relate to. As you said, otherwise everyone doing what's right in their own eyes, trouble, and we're in that trouble right now. So I like that as a starting point. And when the focus is on God, we have something to draw us together. That is the draw. The fact that we all focus on God draws us together. We're being pulled into that one. And without that focus, we have a problem. The American ethos is the rugged individual. And I have to go along with Paul. What do you have that you did not receive? From breath to water. I mean, so it's ludicrous for us to focus anywhere else. And yet we have a society that has grown up and grown off, really, with so many ideas because we have disavowed the absolute. And the absolute was there in the beginning. The early Congress meetings, whenever they had to debate something for consideration as a law, they would have a local minister come in and say what the Bible said about those things. Now you can't even get a Bible in the room. There's so much mess going on because the absolute that God gave has been disavowed, but it has not gone away. And until we get back to the God of the Word, we won't be able to get back to the Word of God.
Yeah, and I would just and add to that, particularly talking, and although I hadn't used the language before, right, for us seeing the law as a floor and not a ceiling, right? There is a danger, right? And I concede this, which one can fall into, which is making the performance of the law perhaps unintentionally, but nevertheless turning compliance into the law success for its own sake.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
the greatest Jewish sages always tell us that study of the law really has two purposes, right? One is kind of the minimal day-to-day purpose, which is if I want to ensure that my actions will comply, will comport with at least minimally what the greater abstract values are hoping that I'll put into daily practice, right? I can't wait until I learn and study and understand, the connection to everything. So so I need, a foundation. All right. At least I know if I'm doing this, and this, then I know that even if I haven't had a chance to learn and to understand more deeply how this is a reflection and what are the greater values that this is representing, I can at least feel comfortable that my actions are falling in line with what earlier sages and authorities have studied deeply and have come to the conclusion of this is how best to reflect these abstract values in day-to-day living. So that's fine. I need that. Right? But if I leave it at that, right, then now this is just about sort of automatic practice and observance, right? I've unintentionally cut it off from the divine connection, right? The divine abstract values. So what I'm also supposed to do, but this is in a sense the harder part because it requires more of me, which is not being satisfied with, and this is where I think, on the one hand, the Jewish tradition has always said that those Christians who misunderstood us and accused us of mere legalism were unfair. But what we don't always want to admit is that while that may be true and it may be unfair, that that's what our tradition is about, there's a uncomfortable truth that we don't always want to admit to ourselves, which is not that that's what it's supposed to be, but sometimes that's what we allow it to turn into. When we stop with the what is the law and don't continue on with, and let's delve into why the law is what it is and understanding how it's a reflection of other values, divine values, maybe the interplay between a multiplicity of divine values, right? Which is where things get complicated, right? If it's just one value, that's easy, right? When we've got multiple values coming into play, right? That's when things get complex. And as life presents us with different challenges, how do I figure out how to implement in practice the interplay of those values in my day-to-day life? That's and what I'm hopefully doing is, if I understand what the law is as it's understood today, right? My part of my goal is to move backwards, right? Re-engineer, in a sense, right, from the law back up to what the ultimate divine values are and how they interplay with each other, and that I come closer into contact with the mind of God in whatever way it is that our limited capacity to to understand and grasp that. Um,
Very clear. Thank you so much. This has been rich. Thank you kindly. We have our foundation laid and with clarity this time. We appreciate your time, Rabbi.
no,
Indeed.
it's my pleasure, and hopefully I'm looking at my calendar, but if I can also, I know you're delving into it, even without me, but also an opportunity to look specifically, perhaps from the Jewish understanding of and Jewish interpretation of that chapter that you've been unpacking in your own way. I'd be pleased to have an opportunity to share some of our understanding of what that chapter means and how its discussion of fasting fits into sort of the traditional Jewish way of understanding what fasting is for us, because I also think there is clearly a difference in how Jews think about fasting, which fits in with our understanding of that covenantal relationship. And I think some of how you frequently think about fasting, which is not to suggest, and I want to be clear, right? I'm not suggesting right or wrong, but merely other ways, and being open to not necessarily agreeing with, but being enriched, which is what I always hope for myself, right? When I'm in dialogue with others, it's not merely for me the desire to understand simply for understanding's sake, although that's beneficial, right? Eliminating ignorance is always a good thing. But I hope that in eliminating my own ignorance, I'm also being enriched by other perspectives, even if they're not entirely the same as my own. But
yeah, that's
it
quite
can
interesting.
contribute to
So
me.
even perhaps if you can't fit our time slot in your calendar, we may have another independent closed Zoom session like this, because that's quite fascinating. That got my ears going. Yours too, Sandra, when you said
Yes,
there's
yes,
a difference perhaps in what fasting. We've got to hear that, Rabbi.
yes.
So let's at least have another closed Zoom session to address specifically that, please.
So it would be my pleasure.